What's up, everybody? It's Brian with MTNMix.com, and today I want to talk about mastering. So shall we?
Who done it, we run it, yeah. Get charted to learn it, we want it, yeah. We counting the money, it's abundant, yeah.
So what is mastering? Mastering is that final step. The mixing's done. You need a little bit more volume. You need a little bit more cohesiveness, a little bit more glue to really finalize that song and put it out to the public on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, Amazon Music, whatever you're putting your music on. It's that final step that will make it a radio-ready record. So I'm going to be showing you guys on the screen a record that I recently mastered. A majority of it was done in Izotope Ozone 7, and that's what I'm going to be going through. It's a really great plugin for mastering. It kind of gives you everything that you need in a really nice graphical interface. So without further ado, let's go ahead, hop on the screen. I'll show you how I mastered the song 100 by an artist named Tense. So here we are in the session. I got the record up. It's called 100 Degrees by the artist Tense that I mentioned earlier. You can see that the only plugin that I have on this record is the Izotope Ozone 7. This is just the wave printout with nothing on the mastering bus or the mix bus from when the record was mixed. So I'm going to pull up Izotope Ozone 7, and you can see right off the bat, it's pretty cool. It has a modular design, if in case you haven't seen it. If you haven't, it's a whole different video. But we're going to start off. I'm going to play the record for you, and I'm going to bypass everything and then turn it all on so you guys could really understand what ended up happening for this record. Please note, when I do turn this bypass off, the volume will jump a little bit. Don't get scared. It's just the limiter acting and working. So take a listen.
You fronted on me, now them hundreds on me. 100 degrees till we burning them out. Now they stuck in the sea, waiting to drown, caught in the wave.
Cool. So we're going to go one by one. We're going to turn these guys off and really build the master. So the first thing that I like to do is my EQ. In this case, I use the module from Izotope Ozone 7. It's called Vintage EQ, and it has this sort of old school look to it. What I did here is I did some mid-side EQ. You get to choose between stereo, mid-side, or left and right. I started off focusing on the mids, and I did two things here. I boosted the low mids at 200 hertz pretty substantially, 5 decibels. That'll really bring out those low frequencies. And then in order to kind of shelve it off and bring it back to 0, I had a mid-cut of 5.3 decibels at 300 hertz. So you could see here on this graphical line for the frequency spectrum, these are the lows, these are the highs. It's boosted at 200 hertz with a sort of like a shelf kind of looking thing, and then it gets cut down at these low mids at 300 hertz. So I'm gonna go one at a time. I'll play it and then turn this on. Just pay slight attention to the low end of the record when I'm turning the EQ on.
You fronted on me, now them hundreds on me. 100 degrees till we burning them out. Now they stuck in the sea.
So it's very subtle, but it does bring a little bit of energy over to the lows. Then meanwhile, on the side, what I did on the EQ is I boosted with a high Q setting, 4K. And what this did is it brought out more presence of his background vocals. There's a lot of background vocals in this song. A lot of them are panned out to the side, so I wanted to really push some presence into it. So I boosted around where the vocals were living around 4K to really bring those vocals out. That's all I did for the side EQ. Next up is I have a stereo EQ. This is the digital EQ setting on this. I think when you pull up this module, it defaults to analog, but I switched it over to the digital setting. Now this is a stereo, and it's cutting at around 4K, a little bit below 4K, and you might be thinking, well, you just boosted 4K on the last EQ, but the only difference is this is going to be a cut on the stereo EQ. So it's not focusing on the mids and the sides. It's going to be acting everything as a whole. And this will really kind of tame down those vocals. I thought the vocals were a little bit too sharp as a whole. So I put it in this this negative 3.9 decibel cut. It might even be a little excessive, but I think it got the job done. Take a listen to it before and after.
You fronted on me, now them hunters on me. 100 degrees till we burning them out. Now they stuck in the sea, waiting to drown. Caught in the wave, made a new sound.
It just smooths out the vocals a lot, in my opinion. Really kind of glues it together without even needing any dynamics processing. Speaking of dynamics processing, it's the next thing that I did. This is a multi-band compressor. So I really wanted to focus on those vocals. Again, I think that they're still a little bit sharp, especially when I was listening in speakers. And in order to tame that down, I decided to create a just 2-to-1 compression on these high mids. You get to dial in different settings for each frequency band, and I really wanted to focus on these high mids. So all I did was really have a pretty moderately slow attack at 20 milliseconds, a 60 millisecond release with a 10 knee. So it's a smooth compression curve right there, and then just a 2-to-1 ratio. So it's a very minimal amount of compression. I didn't want to get rid of the dynamic of the beat in the background. I just wanted to sort of glue the vocals in together with the beat. And then all I did was just adjust its threshold. As far as the other bands go, I didn't do any compression on the lows, the highs, and then I did a tiny bit, probably doesn't even make a difference in the low mids. So I'll let you visualize. I'll play the record, and I'll start with the bypass and turn it on.
You fronted on me, now them hunters on me. 100 degrees till we burning them out. Now they stuck in the sea, waiting to drown. Caught in the wave, made a new sound. 100 straight cash, had to swim my swagger. I know that they mad, yeah. Just look at me now, yeah.
So you can see that the highs and the lows didn't even hit. It's really the low mids and the high mids that were really the only things being compressed. And again, they're very subtle. The next thing, and probably my favorite module of Ozone 7, is this imager. It's very similar to the Waves S1 imager, except with this you get to break down the different frequencies into 4 different bands, and you could really dial in the width that you want for those particular frequencies. For this record, since it's sort of like an R&B hip-hop with a little bit of trap mixed in, I don't even know what genre you'd really call this, I like to have my lows coming straight down the middle of the mix, and for that, I decided to actually bring down the stereo width of my low frequencies. By doing that, it'll make sure that all the low frequencies, the bass, the 808 is coming down the center of the mix. And as far as the next band up, the low mids, it's pretty similar story. I brought a tiny bit of width out of it, but again, barely noticeable. You'll start seeing some differences when you go over to the high mids and the highs. I like to have my hi-hats, as far as the highs goes, the hi-hats, cymbals, anything along those lines, the brightness of snare drums. I like to have those sounding pretty wide, so I boosted that 32.9. And then as far as where the vocals are living, I boosted that just because I like to have that wide sounding background vocal feel. So I boosted that. Go ahead, take a listen to this.
You fronted on me, now them hunters on me. 100 degrees till we burning them out. Now they stuck in the sea.
To me, it's a pretty clear difference, especially if you're listening in headphones. If you aren't listening in headphones right now and you're listening to your monitors, I suggest go grab a pair of headphones and then take a listen to that example again. Just rewind it. It's definitely a very cool difference, and I think that this imager does a great job of creating stereo width. Then the last thing that we're going to be going into as far as the module that I use for Ozone 7 is this vintage limiter. There's 2 modules for limiters in this plugin. It's the vintage limiter and then Ozone's maximizer. I like the vintage limiter a little bit better. I think it has more of a transparent sound, less digital sounding, even though it still is digital. There's 3 different modes that you could choose between: analog, tube, and modern. I generally see myself going with modern. It has a little bit of faster of an attack and a release, so you could really kind of push that volume without distorting any of the audio. So what I like to do is I set my ceiling to -0.1 or -0.2 generally. If you're working with the Waves L2, I actually like to set it at -0.3 just to give it a little bit of headroom. But for this plugin, I've never saw any issues really with -0.1. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to bring this threshold bar down until you start to get a noticeable amount of volume gain, but you don't sacrifice any of the dynamics or introduce any audio artifacts like distortion or anything like that into there. So I'm going to go ahead and do just that. Take a listen.
You fronted on me, now them hundreds on me. 100 degrees till we burning them out. Now they stuck in the sea, waiting to drown. Caught in the wave, made a new sound. 100 straight cash, had to swim, I swear, yeah. I know that they mad, yeah. Just look at me now, yeah. Had to run it back, yeah. Had to run the shit back, yeah. Hundreds of cash, I don't need match, look at me now, yeah. Hundreds of cash, I don't need match, look at me now. Hundreds of cash, You fronted on me, now them hundreds on me. 100 degrees till we burning them out. Now they stuck in the sea, waiting to drown. Caught in the wave, made a new sound. 100 straight cash, had to swim, I swear, yeah. I know that they mad, yeah. Just look at me now, yeah. Had to run it back, yeah. Had to run the shit back, yeah. Hundreds of cash, I don't need match, look at me now, yeah. Hundreds of cash, I don't need match, look at me now. Hundreds of cash, hundreds of cash.